I listened to the Chapter 2 recording. It was very long. If you can make it through that one, you can make it through this one. So good luck. And here it is. Chapter 3. In this chapter, I will introduce and develop the concept of fractured immanence, and I shall connect it with the epistemological conception of immanence discussed in Chapter 2. It'll be argued that the epistemological conception of immanence, namely, the view that thinking about the world necessarily unfolds and self-corrects in the midst of our practices, thus rejecting the view from nowhere conception of thought, is best understood as an expression of a resolute rejection of the myth of the given. It is suggested that immanence can provide an illuminating account of the fact that thought is both about the world and within it only if it goes hand in hand with a complete rejection of the given. From this anti-Givennist point of view, what is immanent is the identity necessarily presented as difference between thought and world. Thought is immanent to being, but this immanence is essentially fractured. In this context, I will explore the consequences of resolutely rejecting the given for the nature of our access to the world through thought. I argue that the rejection of givenness implies that at the level of semantics, thinking attempts to grasp the world as such. There are no fixed limits to thinking. For example, transcendental conditions of possibility of experience that prevent it from being semantically about the world as it is in itself. Yet it also implies that the categorical structure or content of the world as such and our relation to it are never themselves given to thinking and are always subject to self-correction. I'll focus on the anti-representational implications of the rejection of givenness and our conception of the mind-world relation. It is argued that a rejection of givenness entails a resolutely anti-representationalism in semantics and ontology and a post-Kantian, critical, and transcendentally informed metaphysics. In this spirit, it is suggested that a non-representational semantics coupled with a non-representationalist ontology can provide a viewpoint from which we launch a positive critique of traditional representationalist substance metaphysics by constructing an alternative evolutionary process metaphysics with anti-representationalist yet realist implications. From this standpoint, the realist view to the effect that there is no barrier in thinking being about the world as it is in itself is rehabilitated but is given an important twist. Ultimately, the semantic aboutness of thought to a common public objective world through reference relations is revealed as an indispensable yet non-representationally functioning tool for collectively coordinating thought considered as natural process in the world, considered as natural process, where the relation between mind and world at this level is not referential, logical, or causal. Rather, it is a non-semantic expressive relation of resonance between dynamically co-evolving environmental, bodily, and brain processes whose degree of adequacy is measured by the degree of empowerment expressed in the collective cognitive processes involved. 3.1.1 The myth of the given and fractured immanence. The rejection of givenness as the denial of transparent relations and of necessary boundaries between mind and world. I shall now attempt to show the intimate connection of epistemological immanence and the fractured immanent relation between mind and world which I advocate with a resolute rejection of the Sellarsian myth of the given. As is well known, the concept of the given is supposed to give content to our conviction that our only guarantee of a non-circular, solid, infinite regress stopper and objective, non-arbitrary access and knowledge about reality is the existence of a point of immediate contact between mind and world, subject and object, that enables the former to have immediate, non-referential knowledge of the latter. This immediate epistemic connection between the knowing subject and the object of knowledge makes the cognitive contact between them immediate and transparent, independent of any other knowledge, and is precisely what constitutes given knowledge, which, by serving as a foundation on which other bits of knowledge could be justified, guarantees the very possibility of knowledge. If we substitute meaning for knowledge and semantic for epistemic in the last sentence above, we arrive at a notion of given meanings, i.e., of the semantic given. More precisely, a certain, usually mental state functions as an epistemic given if 1. It is epistemically independent, that is, has an epistemic content independently of any formal or material inferential relations to which it may stand in with other contents, and 2. It is epistemically efficacious, that is, capable of transmitting its epistemic status to other states or contents, thereby accounting for the possibility of objective knowledge. Again, if we substitute semantic for epistemic and purport for knowledge in the above definition, we arrive at a definition of the semantic given. It is important here to note that by characterizing the given as a myth, we do not object to the notion of immediate non-inferential knowledge, that is, knowledge that is not inferred by other knowledge. What one thereby objects to is the idea that the immediate non-inferential knowledge in question is presuppositionless, that it is out there, in the world or in here, the mind. Independently of its functional role within a historically evolved categorical framework transmitted through language from generation to generation. In Sellars' later work, he suggests that the most general form of the myth of the given is that of the categorical given, namely, the view that if a person is directly aware of an item which in fact has categorical status C, then the person is aware of it as having categorical status C. The categorical given is intimately related to the epistemic or semantic given. It is what explains why and how certain mental states can be semantically or epistemically independent and efficacious. That is, it provides the ontological foundation for the semantically or epistemically givenist functions of those states. The given can play its foundational role just because the categorical structure of reality is imposed on or discloses itself to the subject who receives it as it really is in perception, thought, and action. One falls prey to this version of the myth if one takes it that there is a direct classificatory awareness of categories such as sorts, resemblances, facts, universals, and even particulars, independently of our acquisition of a categorical framework through which our initiation to language occurs. The categorical structure of the world, or of the mind, cannot be somehow directly read off or intuited on the basis of the basic descriptive and explanatory concepts of the categorical framework which we actually employ in our everyday language. Those concepts, though capable of yielding direct knowledge of the world and our place in it in the context of categorical systems of which they are part, are nonetheless not unchangeable essences which put us in direct conceptual contact with the essential categorical structure of the world or the mind. As Sellars writes, to reject the myth of the given is to reject the idea that the categorical structure of the world, if it has a categorical structure, imposes itself on the mind as a seal imposes an image on a melted wax. Another way to put this point is that immediacy must not be equated with transparency. An experiential or mental state is transparent if, by just undergoing such an experience, its mode of being is thereby given in propria persona, as it really is. Or in other words, if by just having an experience one is thereby aware of its categorical status. I do not deny that an experiential or mental state can be directly present to non-conceptual consciousness in an unmediated manner. The sense of a transparent access to these states that is in dispute is the further view that this kind of direct, unmediated awareness amounts to a direct awareness of the categorical status of the state in question. Now, as Sellars has convincingly shown, the given is ultimately a myth. In the last analysis, the supposed secure and transparent immediacy of semantic, epistemic, or categorical content revealed by sensuous, intellectual, or categorical intuition in an epistemically foundational manner, by being deprived of any logical, presuppositional, inferential connection to the categorical and empirical knowledge articulated in our ordinary and scientific epistemic practices, the given ultimately undermines itself as it lacks the resources to distinguish between cases in which the supposedly transparent intuitional content is actually thus and so, and cases in which it only seems to be thus and so. And in such a case, as Wittgenstein puts it, whatever is going to seem right to me is right, and that only means that here we cannot talk about right. The atomistic insulation of foundational epistemic content from all categorical and empirical presuppositions of our space of reasons practices ultimately deprives it of its normative power, since this content cannot be meaningfully constrained by the authority of something external to its own conditions of enunciation, e.g., worldly objects, and is thus deprived of the resources for recognizing the authority that objects have as the arbiters of the legitimacy of its claims. In other words, for a subject's utterance to have normative force, the subject must be able to meaningfully posit a gap between things and experiences, and he must understand about how epistemic authority works and when it becomes binding to know when he can claim that this gap is closed. Quote, Kukla, 2000. Conversely, the inclusion of those categorical and empirical presuppositions in this foundational epistemic content deprives it of its privileged foundational character, as in such a case, it becomes another space of reason's content or principle which, however central it might be in our worldview, is subject to self-correction and is ultimately, quote, one among many which compete for adoption in the marketplace of experience, aka empirical inquiry. Thus, the bottom line of the critique of the semantic, epistemic, and categorical given is that for something to function in semantically or epistemically significant ways is for it to be a node, to play a functional role within what Sellars calls the logical space of reasons, or what Brandom calls the language game of giving and asking for reasons. The space of reasons is a socially articulated logical space in which persons have their being. To be a denizen of space of reasons, of the space of reasons, is to be sensitive to certain collective pattern-governed behavioral habits regarding language entry transitions, perception, intra-language transitions, inference, and language exit transitions, action, in a way that places them in a network of reciprocally recognized rights and duties, cans and oughts, pertaining to meaning, knowledge, and action. And the important point regarding the categorical status of claims placed within the space of reasons is that the rationality of the latter, and thus derivatively of the categorical status of those claims, does not depend on its having any synchronic foundations, but in its diachronic, self-correcting character, namely the fact that, within it, any claim can be put into jeopardy, though not all at once. The connection between the rejection of givenness and epistemological immanence thus becomes obvious. The latter, epistemological immanence, is one of the most important implications of the rejection of givenness. For to reject the given is to realize that our knowledge of the world and ourselves is not constructed from a given or a priori foundation from first principles provided by reason or sensibility, but always already presupposes that we live within a world which we act in and of which we have some provisional understanding and knowledge. This understanding and knowledge is provisional in that it is always subject to self-correction in response to pressing incompatible commitments in our overall system of understanding ourselves and the world. Thus, to say that the conceptual system that expresses our current conception of ourselves and the world is provisional is to say that it also thereby is reflective and critical, and in that no element of our current conceptual framework is absolutely beyond question. It also remains open to new experiences and new ways of organizing experience. There is no privileged God's eye view from which we can antecedently survey the space of possibilities, the totality of possible worlds, and compare it with actuality. This implies that our understanding and knowledge of the categorical structure and empirical content of the world and our minds are never themselves given to thinking and are always subject to self-correction. Yet, crucially, this does not mean that thinking falls short of semantically referring to the world as such, meaning the world as it is in itself. Although this might not be directly evident, it is one of the most important implications of the rejection of givenness. If this is so, it follows that transcendentally informed positions according to which thinking is intentionally directed towards something else than the world as such, like Kant's phenomenal world or Husserl's life world, avoid metaphysical dogmatism only at the cost of surreptitiously reintroducing some form of controversial givenness. The same goes if in place of Kant's phenomenal world or Husserl's life world, we put the world as horizontally given and transcendentally bounded by the socio-historical embeddedness of our concepts, our social upbringing, our class interests, our gender, our biological constitution as a species, etc. At best, these are broadly causal factual limitations of our knowledge of ourselves and the world, not transcendentally necessary epistemic boundaries that preclude access to the world as it is in itself. To see this, let us briefly recall why transcendental philosophy feels the need to transcendentally delimit thinking about the world within the bounds of experience or intuition, and hence intentionally correlate it with something less, more, or in any case, other than the world to court. In Kant's case, thinking about the categorical structure of the external world and of the mind is said to be intentionally directed to the phenomenal world, namely the world of actual and possible representings, as opposed to the world as it is in itself. Because thought about the world is strictly delimited by the Kantian forms of intuition and the categories of understanding that synthesize the former. And since the spatio-temporal forms of intuition are contingently projected to the world by peculiarities of the spatio-temporal forms in which we humans process external stimuli, they do not disclose to us the world as it is in itself, independently of those forms, but only the world as an object of actual and possible representings, the phenomenal world. Similarly, in Husserl's case, thinking about the categorical structure of the world and the mind is delimited by, and thus cannot transcend, life-world categories which are essentially intuitable. An example here is the fact, revealed by categorical intuition, that color and extension are necessarily features of external objects. Non-intuitable categories of thinking about the world, such as scientific ones used in explanations in physics, biology, or psychology, can be legitimized only by referring them back to the originary, sensuous life-world intuitive structures that evoked them. Another, more recent view exemplifying a similar way of thinking about the relation between thinking, experience, and the world, and which does not officially belong to the transcendental camp, is the Wittgensteinian one, according to which the world disclosed to thinking can be meaningfully conceived as independently existing and as independently positing the features attributed to it by our empirical scientific practices only on condition that we recognize in the concept of the independent world, as revealed in our practices, the trail of the human serpent, to quote William James, 1906. This is because, according to the Wittgensteinian view, the content of the concept of the objective world is a function of our historically evolved and diachronically evolving rule-following practices of using this concept, and these rule-following practices are not grounded by invariant metaphysical essences, but are ultimately response-dependent and species-specific. They exist only because we, as a form of life, happen to have relatively similar responses on what counts as criteria of similarity and difference in our use of this concept. See Cavell, Kripke, and Wittgenstein's later work. What all these views, as well as many other post-Kantian correlationist ones, have in common is that in their effort to protect thought from its dogmatic speculative forays into the absolute, they attempt to put forward transcendentally secured, cognitive-cum-experiential conditions that avoid metaphysical dogmatism by anchoring abstract thinking about the metaphysical structure of the world to more concrete cognitive and experiential patterns of ours, such as the categories of our everyday life world in Husserl, the species-specific forms of our spatio-temporal intuition in Kant, or the de facto agreement in our patterns of response in using a concept in the context of our form of life, as in Wittgenstein. It is precisely because they conceive of these transcendentally revealed experiential patterns and conditions as semantically more transparent and epistemically more secure than the contents of thinking about the world that abstracts from these conditions that make them feel entitled to say that if thinking is to be about the world, it must be exercised within a strictly and antecedently delimited domain, possible experience, categorical intuition, normative attitudes that constitute the content of our concepts in the form of life. Otherwise, they would not have any reason to believe that the view that thinking is intentionally directed toward the world is such independently of these antecedently delimited conditions necessarily commits one to a dogmatic, experientially unconstrained metaphysics. Yet, in this way, they surreptitiously reintroduce a form of endogenous givenness in their thinking by taking it for granted that we have a semantic and epistemically secure access to the form of our spatio-temporal intuition, as in Kant, to the categorical structure of the life world by distilling its essences from the framework of perceptual experience through categorical intuition as in Husserl, or to the structure and function of our semantic and epistemic practices, as in Wittgenstein. In all these cases, it seems that the fact that these structures, spatio-temporal intuitional form, phenomenological intuition of essences, structure and function of our semantic and epistemic practices, are ours. An essential feature of our mindedness entitles us to believe that we thereby have privileged access to the essential nature independently of empirical inquiry into their structure and content. Here I want to make clear that whereas I take it that the above kinds of views are deeply problematic, I also think that they have a kernel of truth that must be retained as part of any sound philosophy. What is problematic with these views is not their demand for an experiential anchoring of thinking or their focus on the ways in which the evolutionary and socially induced contingencies of our subjective constitution, sensibility, imagination, understanding, shape thinking's access to the world, objectively, and ourselves. The problem is the reification of the evolutionarily come socially induced coloring of thought's access to the world by our evolutionarily come socially shaped experience and similarity responses into an antecedently understood a priori epistemological boundary between thought and world. It is only if we construe this evolutionary experiential coloring as an epistemological boundary that we end up endorsing a form of endogenous givenness and feel the need to say that if thinking is to be about the world, this world must be something other than the world as it is in itself. For while it is true that there is such an evolutionarily induced experiential influence and limitation of thought's access to the world, arguably the spatio-temporal form and qualitative content of the proper and common sensibles have evolved through the millennia of evolution for survival purposes, it is true that the categorical structure of this very experiential boundary between thought and world is not self-intimating, and is not transparent to itself. It can only reach semantic self-consciousness by schematizing itself through categories of thinking. Indeed, the historical development of self-correction of empirical concepts and categories in the course of empirical scientific inquiry can itself be seen as an expression of a dynamic schematizing function of experience in its effort to restore incompatibilities in its total experience of itself in the world. From this point of view, while it is true that experience provides epistemic friction to thinking about the world, it is also true that experience does not do so by being antecedently known to itself, but by being epistemically distinguished by thinking through criteria immanently constituted and self-corrected in the same course of inquiry by our total system of beliefs, to quote Quine. The same goes if in place of our evolutionary experiential coloring of the world, we put its socio-historical coloring as expressed in the historical a priori categories that simultaneously enable and limit, in ways that are synchronically invisible to us, our access to the world in different historical epochs, as in Foucault, Heidegger, and Spengler. These enabling and limiting categorical conditions of our access to the world that function as historically a priori conditions of intelligibility are not antecedently known to themselves, but are determined as such, as enabling and limiting conditions, only by being retrospectively understood as appearances of a reality, as the latter is conceptualized by the lights of each community's current categories. This, of course, does not mean that our present categories of making sense of the world and our place in it are metaphysically privileged. Every categorical system is based on background assumptions that can be potentially challenged and retrospectively revealed as placing arbitrary and unjustified limits on intelligibility. But while these limits are non-conceptually expressed in the very application of any conceptual system to the world, they can be conceived as limits only by becoming determinate contents of thought within a semantic and epistemic space, the space of reasons, where there are no a priori transcendental barriers or boundaries between thinking and being. To determine limit in thought, to place it within the space of reasons, is already to transcend it, even if initially only in thought. Talk about limits or enabling conditions of intelligibility has a point only as part of a self-correcting dialectic between what counts as appearance and what counts as reality at each point of inquiry, and not as something that can be a priori conceived through non-empirical, aka transcendental, phenomenological methods of inquiry. Thus, the fact that thought is ontologically constrained by the evolutionarily sedimented structure of experience, and epistemically constrained by conceptualized experience in the historically mutable context of our total system of beliefs, does not imply that thought is epistemically delimited by experience, history, or society in a way that prevents it from being about the world as such, i.e., independently of its being an object of actual or possible experience by us. To believe so is to reify the evolutionary and socio-historically induced shaping of thought's access to the world through experience into epistemological boundaries between mind and world, and to mistake the natural and social mechanisms that shape our access to the world for transcendental necessities. 3.12 Fractured Immanence and Objectivity. Moreover, this resolute rejection of Givenness has important implications for the clarification of the sense in which the relation of thought to the world through experience can be said to be an immanent one. As has been already mentioned earlier, I take it that a resolute rejection of Givenness implies the mind-world immanence is essentially a fractured one. Mind and world stand in a direct, unmediated, immanent ontological relation whose intelligibility yet presupposes a transposition of mind and world as semantically and epistemically correlated poles of a diachronic self-correcting process that ultimately aims to align our conceptual understanding of mind and world to mind and world as natural processes. This unmediated direct relation between world and mind is given in a non-epistemic sense of the term, in the form of a pre-subjective and pre-objective monadic perspectival openness to the world. But this experiential givenness is not epistemically given to itself as to its categorical structure and function. It is a givenness which is neither conceptually nor non-conceptually transparent to itself. This view is very close in spirit, though not identical, with what Brasier calls de-leveled immanence, according to which what is immanent is the conceptual semantic difference between thoughts and worldly things, not their identity. Note that here Brasier's Sellars-inspired view is consistent with holding that thought and being are identical in the order of being. In other words, the logical difference between thoughts and things is not an ontological difference. Thoughts are just things considered in terms of logical or epistemic powers, rather than their material powers alone. Our view does not completely coincide with Brasier's de-leveled conception of immanence. The epistemological critique of Givenness points toward an immanent mind-world ontology where both mind and world are considered as naturalistically construed absolute processes that can make themselves explicit as such only by the self-fracturing of this immanence and its transposition into a representational relation between mind and world considered as distinct kinds of substances. In view of this fact, I suggest what is immanent is the asymmetric identity presented as symmetric difference between thought and things. More specifically, it can be argued that what is immanent is the identity presented as a difference between the world, the mind, and experience, viewed as conceptually represented contents and as patterns of occurrence in non-conceptually articulated processual representings. In Sellars' Science and Metaphysics, he introduces the distinction between the world and the mind as conceptually represented and as non-conceptual states of representings, and interprets this distinction in a transcendental, naturalist manner, as expressing a naturalist mind-world relation and general ontology, which however is transcendentally justified from within the conceptual order. Obviously, the above fractured immanent account of the relation between mind and world is inspired by Sellars. However, Sellars never discusses the issue of immanence and does not distinguish between different kinds of immanence. Thus, I am not sure that he would concur with the views about immanence developed in this book. Yet since my purpose here is not interpretive but systematic, this issue can be put aside for now. Immanence is thus fractured because what we know about the mind, the world, and their experiential tie as conceptually represented contents is immanently conditioned in ways that currently elude us by the manner in which the world, the mind, and their experiential tie non-conceptually exist in our representing acts. But this fracture between the mind-world relation as conceptually represented and as non-conceptually registered in acts of representing, being precisely immanent and itself dynamically unfolding as such, far from secluding the fractured realms of conceptually represented contents and non-conceptually representing acts, actually internally relates them as distinguishable yet inseparable poles of cognitive inquiry that calibrate one another and mutually self-correct so as to maximize explanatory coherence in our total system of beliefs. Indeed, it can be argued that the very end of inquiry consists in incorporating ever more facts about the non-conceptual structure of representings that subjectively color our access to the world and ourselves into conceptually represented facts. The manner in which we conceptually represent the world is always conditional upon the categorical structure of language, our biology, ideological factors, etc., in ways that can potentially distort our conceptual representation of the world, as their subjective, biased ways in which they filter information remain invisible and pass for impartial, objective knowledge. But since we can represent these conditions that subjectively mediate what we take to be an objective representation of the world and ourselves, we can always turn unacknowledged facts about the non-conceptual structure of representings into conceptually represented facts. We can make explicit these conditions of representation and question their claim to objectivity by revealing their objectivating structure and function. Cf. Catron. Of course, there is a never-ending process. Any such condition can be potentially challenged, though not all at once, since some conditions synchronically function as background enabling constraints of the very intelligibility of our conceptual representations. Yet the very same non-conceptual representings that condition conceptually represented contents and are synchronically unchallengeable from the latter's point of view can be retrospectively made explicit and challenged from the standpoint of an expanded system of conceptually represented contents operating with novel, more inclusive, and more comprehensive concepts and categories. This is how inquiry, in its most general sense, works, by constant diachronic expansions of its conceptual and categorical space in the face of irresolvable incompatibilities in its systems of conceptual represented concepts, where the resolution of these incompatibilities demands the thematization of the fundamental ideological background assumptions that produced and sustained them, and their critical delimitation as objectivating projections in reality that reflect our subjective, evolutionary, psychological, socio-historical standpoint. This is how objective knowledge is attained from a fractured immanent standpoint. Importantly, we should not view the above self-correcting process of unearthing the objective presuppositions of objective representation as sketching a picture of the world in itself by abstracting away from facts about our subjective constitution, evolutionary development of societal position, and conceiving of the in itself as the remainder of this subtraction. As we saw in the course of inquiry, many purportedly paradigmatic instances of objective knowledge about the world and ourselves are challenged and replaced by the knowledge of the manner in which the origin, structure, and function of our non-conceptual experience representings are objectivating by actively, albeit obliviously, constructing projections about ourselves in the world. The point here is not to purge that which is comprehended by objective knowledge, namely the world as it is in itself, from all subjective contribution, e.g. the specific spatiotemporal, causal, sensible, and conceptual structure endowed to human organisms by biological and cultural evolution, as if the latter is nothing more than an illusory projection on the in itself. The point is to supplement it with these projective structures. They are too a fractured way of being in the world in itself, while simultaneously reconceiving the structure and content of the in itself such that it becomes possible to understand how this pluriverse of projective worlds constitute intrinsic variations on the same theme, the in itself, and how the in itself is such as to intrinsically give rise to this pluriverse. This would be the way of construing the appearance-reality distinction from a fractured immanent as opposed to transcendent viewpoint. In this way, we avoid the spurious equation of objectivity with the elimination of all qualitative and perspectival content, while at the same time become gradually better in distinguishing what our mind contributes to the world from the world's contribution to our minds. Here we agree with Adorno when he insists that with the removal of one of its essential moments, i.e. subjectivity, objectivity is falsified, not purified. The object is not a subjectless residuum. Let me repeat here that the view that immanence must be fractured directly follows from the rejection of the endogenous given, namely, the view that we know our minds first and best. If this is not the case, and if instead we come to understand the contents of our own minds by modeling them to our knowledge of the external world, and to our knowledge of ourselves as social beings interacting in the public sphere through a normatively functioning semantic and categorical framework expressed in language, then it follows that every form of understanding and knowledge of ourselves from within is necessarily mediated by a categorially rich framework that each generation inherits and absorbs through its initiation to our linguistic practices. As I have argued elsewhere, I take it that this framework has roughly the categorical structure of Husserl's life world or Sellars' manifest image. This framework revolves around two different, yet mutually presupposing and categorically correlated kinds of substance, namely persons and external objects. Persons are substances with normatively individuated mental and bodily capacities and abilities. Persons do not merely causally respond to external circumstances or internal stimulation, but are capable of performing actions based on their intentions and desires that can themselves be assessed on the basis of reasons. Standing over against persons, we find middle-sized external objects, also considered as substances, individuated by their causal powers, and characterized by determinate, proper, and common-sensible properties, indissolubly bound up and experienced as belonging to those objects themselves. The important point for our purposes here is that the basic semantic categories of this framework, through which we understand the relation between persons and worldly objects, thought and reality, namely the category of intentionality or aboutness, which directly links thought and world. To express a thought in the form of an asserted proposition is to use it to say something about the world, i.e., something external to the proposition, are socially, public, and linguistic, and not inner mental categories. Here I follow Sellars, who argues that thought does not possess original intentionality independently of socially articulated semantic categories of aboutness, meaning, reference, truth. Only by constructing a novel categorial space modeled on linguistic aboutness are we in a position to conceive ourselves as possessors of thoughts, sensations, desires, intentions, construed as semantically significant inner mental states to which each of us has direct work, and of the construal of the mind-world connection in semantic terms drawn from our understanding of public language need not be taken as priority in the order of being. We internalize this framework in our mother's knee by learning to speak and to understand the world and ourselves in terms of this framework, but precisely because categorical frameworks are not given. No framework, including the framework in terms of which we perceive, think, and act in the world, has an unchallengeable authenticity. As Sellars eloquently puts this point, all classification of objects, however confident and peremptory, is a venture which at no point finds its justification in a pre-symbolic vision of generic and specific hearts on the sleeves of the objects of experience. Classification resembles the grasping tentacles of an octopus, now tentative, now confident, rather than a salesman's selection of a suit for a customer after a glance at his build. Instead, every framework carries with it the seeds of its own overcoming, as it unfolds and is used in a wider context of immanent, self-correcting principles of inquiry, which, as was mentioned earlier, gradually de-anthropomorphizes our conception of ourselves in the world by incorporating ever more facts about the non-conceptual structure of our relation to the world, that are projected as objectively situated out there in the world or in here in the subject's consciousness, into conceptually represented facts. In this way, by means of an immanent critique, that is, by self-correcting principles of inquiry immanently unfolding and expressed in critically controlled conceptual and categorical change in the face of incompatibilities in our conception of ourselves in the world, we gradually disentangle what our mind contributes to the world from the world's contribution to our minds. We do this by revealing the objectivating and reifying character of the categorical structure of the mind, while at the same time placing its parochial and subjective elements within a picture of an objective world that includes them as its fractured yet immanent world-making projective powers, as opposed to eliminating them from the scheme of things as mere illusions. 3.2 Rejection of the given implies a non-representational semantics and ontology. 3.21 Non-representational semantics. An important consequence of the rejection of the myth of the given, as I understand it, is that all our central semantic concepts of meaning, reference, and truth that at first glance seem to directly connect language or thought to the external world are not at bottom in the business of representing the world, but are actually metalinguistic expressive devices that monitor our epistemic and semantic inferences within the space of reasons as opposed to denoting a relation between conceptually shaped space of reason's contents and non-conceptually worldly events. According to this non-relational view, originally developed by Sellars, semantic terms and descriptions provide functional classifications of linguistic tokens. Sellars' analysis of meaning statements such as rot in German means red, or brother means male sibling, treats them as statements that convey the information that the word mentioned on the left-hand side has a relevantly similar usage to the phrase on the right-hand side. These meaning statements do not explicitly say that the two expressions they each contain have the same usage. Rather, each sentence presupposes that the person it is directed at already understands the background language and uses this expression on the right-hand side as an illustrating sortal to form an indexical predicate, forming a predicate by giving an example bearing the relevant property, which is then applied to the tokens picked out by the expression on the left-hand side of the sentence. From this point of view, meaning is a coordination device indexing our moves with respect to the contents of our assertions within the space of reasons. It is not a relation of correspondence, representation, or intentionality that directly ties mind and language to the external world. Reference receives an analogous treatment. Extensional contexts are limiting cases of intentional ones, specifying the qualities and properties of objects. This is because descriptive extensional vocabulary specifying the identity conditions of objects presupposes modal intensional vocabulary, which makes explicit causal dispositional properties, as in Brandom. From this point of view, we can construe reference statements as in fact quantifying implicitly over senses, that is, functions of expressions, and the extensionality of reference can be understood as a relation of material or extensional equivalence between senses. Lastly, truth is construed as semantic assertability. It is conceived as applying univocally to propositions in all domains of discourse, characterized by rules of correct assertability, empirical, mathematical, ethical, aesthetic, etc., and thus connects language and the world at the semantic level only in a trivial sense in which facts of the form 2 + 2 = 4, Vladimir and Estragon are waiting for Godot, it is cruel to inflict pain for no reason, Monty Pythons have a keen sense of humor, and water is H2O, are the truth makers to which the respective propositional contents correspond and represent. These truth makers are so diverse, expressing both highly abstract mathematical and concrete empirical facts, attitude-independent empirical and attitude-dependent aesthetic facts, and even fictional ones, that it makes no sense to say that there is a substantial metaphysical correspondence relation that univocally ties all these domains with the propositions that are made true by them. And as we shall see later, even empirical truth can be understood as a gradual process of convergence between senses, how things are for us, and reference, how what things are for us ought to be, which yet does not thereby get us beyond the conceptual realm. From this point of view, to construe truth makers as semantically functioning reference that make our beliefs true is to understand them as objectively and independently existing denizens of an external world that essentially exhibits conceptual form. And as we shall see, this form, with all that it entails, substance, property, categorical structure, the world is comprised of facts with objects, properties, and relations as constituents, is not itself out there independently of our normative attitudes that institute our semantic practices, but is rather a projection to the world itself of our linguistic means of representing that make possible and facilitate our collective coordination within the world. The above resolutely non-relational, non-representational conception of the function of meaning, reference, and truth, which is internally connected to the critique of the given, has two important consequences. The first, Language is not tied to the world by a single satisfaction or correspondence relation, but a multitude of relationships between tokens of linguistic expressions and the world. And 2, there is no direct semantic or logical relation between the conceptual and the non-conceptual. Non-conceptual attitude-independent reality is not connected to our beliefs by rational or justificatory relations. Its only direct relation to our beliefs consists in causally evoking or non-epistemically shaping them, for example by means of evolution or social conditioning. The very intentionality of language and thought, namely their capacity to point to a semantically isomorphic world outside themselves, can be understood in terms of inferential relations between token linguistic expressions, and not by means of representational or intentional relations holding between linguistic or mental expressions and extralinguistic, non-conceptually structured reality. Non-conceptual reality poses only causal, evolutionary, or in general, non-epistemic constraints upon our beliefs, thought, and actions, not semantic, epistemic, or logical ones. Here, along with Sellars and his followers Rorty and Brandom, we reject a widely held view about the way in which the content of our empirical beliefs and thoughts is fixed. According to this orthodox view of content determination, the content of an empirical belief is given by its truth conditions. If one understands the content of the empirical proposition, the streets are wet, if one knows what it is for the streets to be wet, that is, under what conditions the streets are actually wet. In this particular case, the knowledge in question stems from perceptual experience, as it seems to be precisely through our sensory modalities that we understand the kinds of things referred to by our empirical beliefs and the conditions under which they are actualized in the world. From this point of view, meaning is understood in terms of propositional contents which function as such by being internal representative signs of objective states of affairs in the external world, independently of their inferential connections to other contents within the space of reasons. Further, in the context of this representational orthodoxy in contemporary analytic philosophy of language, truth is understood in terms of representational accuracy, while its inferential transition to other contents is affected by formal rules of inference. This means that our communal normative practices of giving and asking for reasons do not play any essential explanatory role in accounting for meaning, reference, and truth, but whatever role they are to play must be strictly derived from the truth-conditional relations of linguistic contents as the latter are expressed in formal logic. Yet, from this point of view, it is difficult to explain the epistemic and semantic powers of the material, non-logical content of empirical thought, except by appeal to either a self-justifying given element in experience, or to relations of correspondence between the empirical content in question and its truth conditions which are epistemically and semantically invisible, meaning external to the subject, and then we can call this the thermometer of content, the thermometer view of content. The thermometer model compares non-inferential knowledge with a good thermometer. The temperature readings of a good thermometer reliably indicate the actual temperature. In a similar manner, non-inferential knowledge is a matter of belief reliably co-varying with the environment, irrespectively of whether the subject understands its content or has reasons for taking it as true. This externalist view first came under attack in Sellars' 1956 work as part of a general attack on the whole framework of Givenness. These solutions, thus far, seem unsatisfactory. See Brandom and Rorty. Here it must be noted that there are more sophisticated representational theories of meaning, truth, and reference. See McDowell, which are not directly affected by the Sellarsian objections to representational theories, since they construe both parts of the word-world relation as belonging within the space of reasons. Moreover, these more refined versions of representational theories of meaning and truth avoid the above discussed classic objections against more mainstream such theories in contemporary philosophy of language. Yet, they are not without difficulties. Very roughly, this is because relational theories of McDowell's stripe, thereby conceiving the very externality and independence of the world in conceptual, normative, space of reasons terms, presuppose that language is always already categorially tailored to represent the structure of the world and cannot independently explain the construction of those very categories themselves through language. Along with Sellars, I think that there must be some explanation of the very categorical space connecting language and world, without appeal to space of reason's concepts, such as those of linguistic or mental content, or else we succumb to a version of the categorical given, according to which there is a pre-established harmony between our categories and the world. Later we shall see, to achieve this we need to posit an acategorical, non-normative mode of correspondence between mind, language, and world. Sellars' concept of picturing served exactly this purpose. 3.22 Non-representational process evolutionary ontology. How can we combine non-representationalism in semantics, which rejects substantial word-world meaning, truth and reference relations, with the anti-Givenness realist view to the effect that our thinking does not stop short of the world as it is in itself? In my view, this can best be done if we complement non-representationalism in semantics with an ontology that makes this feature explicit in its own structure. At first glance, the combination of realism and non-representationalist semantics must be considered odd, as most contemporary versions of realism adhere to a naturalistic ontology which, although not directly inconsistent with non-representationalism in semantics, seems to be more naturally combined with representationalist semantics, especially if naturalism is motivated by scientific realist considerations. Doesn't scientific realism, precisely as a self-avowed realist position, imply the existence of substantial word-world meaning, truth, and reference relations? Not necessarily. I take it that one pressing problem for a view that combines naturalistic scientific realism with normatively laden representational semantics is that, by its own lights, there is a naturalistically unbridgeable explanatory gulf between normative semantic properties and all other non-normative dispositional or categorical properties of the universe to which the realist scientific view is ontologically committed. See Hatyangadi 2024 and Kripke. What is more, it can be argued that an explanation of the semantic notions of meaning, truth, and reference word-world relations in non-representational terms is something perfectly natural and only to be expected from a strictly naturalistic standpoint which takes empirical inquiry seriously as the final arbiter of our empirical claims about the structure and content of the world. It is extremely doubtful whether substantial, i.e. representationalist semantic notions of truth and reference, can themselves be consistently investigated in a scientific naturalistic spirit, namely as empirically contingent relations. Instead, in most versions of philosophical naturalism in contemporary analytic philosophy, these semantic properties are treated as non-naturalistically explicable, brute primitives. But if we focus our attention, and surely we must, on the fact that any scientific naturalist position worthy of the name must ontologically commit only to the entities, relations, and facts yielded via the a posteriori descriptive and explanatory methods of empirical inquiry, then it seems that a scientific naturalist has neither need for nor automatically entitlement to the existence of substantial word-world semantic relations, since by naturalism's own lights, this is at best a broadly empirical matter. If this is correct, and if the best scientific, i.e., naturalistically acceptable explanation of the word-world semantic relations is non-representationalist in character, then we have an argument from within empirical inquiry itself that commits us, if we are realists, to a non-representationalist account of semantic facts. Thus, strangely enough, a non-representationalist realism, including scientific realism, is not realist enough unless it leads to an ontology that makes this non-representational dimension of semantics explicit in its own structure. How must the world be like if it is to include human beings whose semantic and epistemic practices orient them to the surrounding world without directly mirroring the latter? For the moment, I will merely indicate that to my mind, a most likely candidate for this role would be an immanent Darwinian ontology of processes of differential adaptation in which interaction with the environment, aka other processes, differentially selects, preserves, and reproduces certain elements while eliminating others. This insight is encapsulated in the concept of habit, which is roughly any tendency of a regularity to respond in generally specifiable ways to generally specifiable situations, as in purse. The basic concepts of this Darwinian ontology, random variation, selection, inheritance of adaptive traits and habits of response, are functional and thus broad enough to allow for specifically different realizations of evolutionary processes in organic, cultural, and even non-organic contexts. That is, they can be used to explain not only evolution at the level of species, but also learning processes at the level of individual, the existence and function of social practices and institutions, including, importantly, semantic social practices, and even the processual dimensions of inorganic structures, including the laws of nature. For example, from this point of view, the assertion language game can be understood in non-representational terms as a multi-purpose tool, sustained by a special kind of utterance involving embodied skillful coping that was selected for due to its capacity to express, align, and revise the behavioral dispositions or other variable aspects of speaker situations in hypersocial niches, where our ancestors increasingly depended on coordination and collaborative action. See Price and Tomasello. Indeed, semantic content itself, namely the content of beliefs and the meanings of sentences, are understood in terms of the roles they play in processes of intelligent, reciprocal adaptation between human organisms and the environment. Empirical inquiry and goal pursuit are the inextricably intertwined aspects of these feedback loopy processes, ultimately cashed out at the level of know-how. Semantic content is selected at the social level as an adaptive tool that can stabilize, control, align, thematize, and criticize our individual, verbal, and related non-verbal dispositions, thus enabling us to reliably orient, i.e., increase our intelligent responses at a collective level in these dynamic organism-environment interaction cycles. Further, it has been recently suggested that the dynamic Darwinian mode of explanation in life sciences goes hand in hand with a process ontology which challenges the substance-based assumptions of traditional ontology and the containment view of the world, according to which the latter is a spatio-temporally fixed coordination system containing objects that change properties or location and interact with one another. Processes such as metabolism, development, and evolution often underlie and provide the explanation for the persistence of more thing-like or continuant processes. This persistence of objects in space and time is not explained by their substantial form, but is a result of more or less stable processes operating at various spatiotemporal scales within the object and between it and its environment. The only reason that we draw a substantial distinction between objects and processes, e.g., melodies, is that the temporal changes characterizing the unfolding of objects can be so minute and slow that they can be practically treated and experienced as immutable. I find this processual turn of life sciences to be on the right track. What is more, I think that we might have reasons to believe that process ontology surpasses substance ontology in its explanatory potential in general, not only in the domain of biology. In what follows, I will attempt to briefly cash out this claim. An important anti-representationalist implication of the rejection of Givenness for ontology is the realization that our whole categorical framework in terms of which we find our way around an everyday life world, built around the category of an object, and correlatively of a subject, conceived as a substance with essential mode, causal, dispositional properties, such as to make individuals belong to certain kinds characteristic of their nature, does not possess an unchallengeable categorical authenticity as a system of classification. Indeed, we have good reasons to believe that the object-property categorical framework, including its semantic representationalist picture of the world, in which the normative order of asserting propositional contents through the use of singular terms, predicates, and universally quantified, subjunctively robust conditionals, mirrors the modal structure of the world, by representing the latter as a realm of causal facts about the properties of objects, is ultimately explanatorily inadequate. And, as we shall see, the reasons for thinking that the process framework is explanatorily preferable to the substance framework arise out of an imminent critique of the latter, in which the substance framework proves to be explanatorily inadequate by its own standards. A general problem here is that the substance property framework leaves out as contingent and insignificant for conceiving the essence of an individual, be it a person or an object, its occurrent, non-iffy, non-dispositional properties. It can thus account only for the quidditas, the whatness, general essence of individuals, and not for their hexiety or their thisness, singular essence. Specifically, it can account for their individuality only with the aid of their accidental properties, and not on the basis of essential ones, as the latter only characterize the general kinds to which many individuals belong. Moreover, relatedly, the substance property framework cannot independently explain why under certain circumstances objects possess or lose their causal dispositions, powers. This can only be done by the identification of the intrinsic occurrent processes that accompany the acquiring or losing of these propensities. Note that since the causal dispositions of objects are constitutive by the latter's identity, we can independently explain the former only by abandoning the category of object, conceived as substance. Also, the substance property framework cannot positively account for observationally unpredicted variation or breakdown of the object's observably expected behavior. For example, in the face of a person's sustainedly incomprehensible deviation from expected verbal or emotional responses in cases of brain damage, the substance property framework can only classify this behavior as anomalous without any positive explanation of what is actually going on and why in the person's mind. Note that to say that behavior is anomalous in the above sense does not amount to saying that it is different from what is expected due to antecedently known abnormal circumstances that hinder the actualization of the object's causal dispositions. The range of circumstances in which the causal dispositions of objects are not actualized due to external obstacles is something that is integral to our understanding of objects. It is antecedently known and, in this sense, does not constitute a case of observationally unpredicted variation of the object's expected behavior. Further, the substance property framework lacks a categorization of intrinsic qualitative sensory and affective processes in sentient organisms, i.e., an intrinsic characterization of qualia, conceiving them as essential yet not intrinsically occurrent causal powers of independent substances, persons, objects, and thus as essential yet not intrinsically occurrent properties which are effectively subordinated to substances. In this way, it lacks categorical resources for an adequate positive phenomenological characterization of veridical experiential phenomena such as illusions or hallucinations. In those cases, the categorical resources of the object property framework, which expresses what Sellars calls the descriptive ontology of ordinary life, cannot positively account for the distinctively sensory character of perceptual experience beyond the point of assuring us that something, somehow, a cube of pink in physical space, is present in the perception other than merely believed in. This is connected to the fact that in the context of the substance property framework, cases of seeing and cases of seeming to see, for example, a pink ice cube, differ only in the endorsement of the intentional content involved, e.g., there is a pink ice cube there, not with respect to the very content itself. Both seeings and appearings are about the pinkness of a sensible quality exemplified by a physical object. Appearings do not refer to special inner objects of a different categorical nature than ordinary objects. It is exactly for this reason that, for example, I am unable to provide any illuminating explanation about what is happening if it is pointed out to me that although it appears to me that there is a pink ice cube in the glass, there is in fact no ice cube, pink or otherwise, in the glass, and maybe no glass either. I can only talk about abnormal conditions of observation and what they do to the perceiver, or I can swear that it was just as if I were seeing a pink ice cube in the glass, but I cannot further determine what is the common experiential element which is phenomenologically indistinguishable in cases of veridical or non-veridical perception alike, beyond conceding that somehow, in something analogous to physical space, there is actually something that is a cube of pink. Notice that this common experiential element has actual existence, though in an unspecified way and non-apperceived as such, because even in non-veridical cases, the experience itself actually exists. It is not merely imagined to be an actually existing experience. The positive categorical status of a cube of pink or physical space, and of the way in which it is present in the perception other than merely believed, is left completely undetermined. Their actuality in sensory experience, their non-iffy character, demands an intrinsic characterization based on our current non-dispositional properties that are neither in the external world nor in the last subject. In the context of the object property framework, subjects are categorically conceived as substances whose perceptual experience is understood as one of its essential iffy properties, that is, as a dispositionally characterized perceptual capacity. That is why the occurrent intrinsic character of sensory and affective non-conceptually articulated experience cannot be located in the subject. Lastly, the substance property framework faces a serious challenge in accounting for the relation between substance and property, where the former role is played by a subject and the latter by its states of sensory consciousness. This problem emerged as a result of the effort on the part of traditional substance metaphysics to accommodate the modern scientific worldview. It did so by appropriating the scientific impact paradigm of causation extorting final and formal causes, and by drawing a sharp categorical distinction between two correlated yet incommensurable realms, the mental and the physical. Yet, the existence and causal efficacy of qualitative experience in sentient organisms, including humans, which seems necessary for building a categorical bridge between the mental and the physical, is rendered unintelligible if interpreted according to the above model. If in its bodily dimension, qualitative sensory experience is understood on the model of substances causally interacting by collision, impact or exchange of discrete parcels of information, e.g., particles colliding with one another, neurons sending signals to one another, its qualitative dimension can only be salvaged by eliminating the causal difference it makes in the world and vice versa. Reductive materialism saves the causal efficacy of experience only by eliminating its qualitative character, construing it as a property of substances such as atoms and neurons that do not exhibit the homogeneity characteristic of qualitative experience. On the other hand, substance dualism and emergent materialism preserve the qualitative character of sensory experience at the cost of making experience either non-physical or essentially epiphenomenal. See Kim and Sellars. Substance dualism posits an entirely distinct non-physical substance as the locus of sensory and in general conscious experience that runs its course alongside the physical world. The body, including the nervous system, but never interacts with it. Emergent materialism denies that there are any substances that exist other than physical ones, and conceives sensory dualism and emergent materialism. It conceives sensory experience as correlated with, but irreducible to, physical brain states. Yet both the substance dualism and emergent materialism fail to explain what the correlation between brain and sensory states consists or why it occurs. Thus, substance dualism makes the causal efficacy of sensory states mysterious, non-physical, while emergent materialism makes it essentially epiphenomenal, since the causal chain at the level of brain states is explanatorily autonomous and sufficient independently of its correlation to sensory states. The correlation itself is an explanatorily superfluous and essentially inexplicable fact. See Landy, 2019. Now, what appears to be a common theme to all the above kinds of criticism explain against the explanatory adequacy of the substance property framework is that its basic categories are tailored to account for the individual substances of the framework and on the basis of iffy properties, dispositional properties, causal powers, mental capacities, that do not do justice to the non-iffy, i.e. non-modal, occurrently existing, intrinsically characterized, and dynamically evolving character of the spatio-temporal unfolding of the individual in question, be it a sensory affective experience or a non-experiential inorganic spatio-temporal unfolding. But to do justice to these features of the unfolding of individuals, and thus of their very haexiety, we must also challenge several other fundamental structural categories of the framework. The substance framework stands or falls as a whole, its categories are mutually supporting, and cannot be changed in a piecemeal manner. Its reliance on kinds, which express the nature of the individuals based on their iffy properties, capacities, causal dispositions, its understanding of fundamental modal categories, possibility, necessity, its sharp categorical distinctions between correlated yet incommensurable ontological realms, mental versus physical, subjective versus objective, real versus illusory, etc. The process-based categorical framework is precisely what emerges out of an immanent critique of the substance object property framework. The latter raises explanatory demands it is in no position to answer. What is the categorical basis of dispositional properties of objects? What explains the observationally unpredicted variation or breakdown of an object's observably expected behavior? What is the character of sensory qualia when the latter do not correspond to external objects, properties, and do not unfold in public space and time? It is as if our epistemic practices raise problems that is, legitimate explanatory grounding demands about accounting for the axiety, the singular essence, or intrinsic character of individual beings, that our proposed solutions, namely the categories of the substance framework, are in no position to answer, and indeed are obliged to cover over by considering these problems as ultimately unintelligible. This also shows that the process framework is not just another dogmatic metaphysical framework, a mere product of armchair speculation that we have no good reason to accept, or one that purports, in the spirit of pre-critical metaphysics, to justify itself in an epistemically transcendent matter, sub specie aeternatus. Another way to make the same point is to see the process categorical framework as the outcome of a transcendental investigation on the conditions under which our conceptual framework is epistemically constrained by an independent external world, as opposed to a world that is a shadow of grammar, a projection of our parochial reified linguistic categories. The investigation in question is transcendental because it begins with the Kantian thought that we can only speak meaningfully about the external independent world by construing it as that which affects us through sensibility, and thus by investigating the structure of the latter, as opposed to rushing into an unconstrained metaphysical speculation about the structure of the world itself. But recall that the given is a myth. The categorical structure of sensibility and of its ultimate worldly cause does not imprint itself on our minds as a seal imprints itself on wax. Thus, the way in which we are affected by the world, by our own minds, is not something about which we can have any transparent categorical knowledge. While our minds are embedded in the in itself, they do not categorically mirror the latter. Indeed, the categories through which we conceptually represent the world and ourselves are not God-given and did not evolve for the purpose of ontological insight, but under selective evolutionary pressures for survival within a largely unpredictable and hostile environment. But this shows that there is no pre-established harmony between mind and world, or between our everyday life world based on the substance property framework and the structure of the world to which it is a conceptual response. The process framework is immanently constructed as an explanatory attempt to provide this independent worldly and experiential constraint on our conceptual structure by unveiling a deeper ontological, non-semantic relation between mind and world, from the point of which the semantic correlation between mind and world at the level of the substance property framework is revealed as epistemically indispensable, yet ontologically dispensable. At the same time, the process framework explains why the substance framework appears, for all practical purposes, to have real worldly purchase. From its standpoint, the categories of the substance framework are evolutionarily and culturally selected due to their ability to abstract, stabilize, and make salient those features of individual processual becomings that facilitate collective coordination. From this standpoint, the categories of the substance framework are to be conceived as special cases with restricted validity. Practically optimal under certain evolutionary and cultural contexts and circumstances of processual categories in a roughly analogous sense in which the laws and principles of Newtonian physics are special cases of their Einsteinian counterparts. The fact that the process framework is consciously constructed as a successor to the substance framework is shown by the fact that it eschews the categories of the latter, as philosophically developed in Aristotle and Kant, as a whole and not just in a piecemeal manner. In the process framework, there are no objects, substances, with causal dispositional properties belonging to kinds, having natures which distinguish them from their actual causal histories by accounting for their dispositional properties. Also, processes are neither physical nor mental. Beyond the physical-mental categorical distinction, there are also subjectless and objectless beyond the subjective-objective or subject-object distinction, actual beyond the real illusory distinction, and endowed with an intrinsic occurrent character, i.e., characterized by intrinsic non-dispositional properties. The ultimate aim of the process framework, as I understand it, is to provide an immanent critique of the substance framework by explaining its explanatory failures and accounting for its apparent explanatory success and practical utility. From this point of view, to immanently criticize a framework does not merely amount to showing its internal tensions and dead ends. It also essentially involves understanding the raison d'etre of these tensions by constructing a new framework whose categories precisely instantiate such an understanding. The issue of whether this process framework is in a position to cash out this promissory notice dimension will be explored in the next chapter. 3.3 The consequences of non-representational semantics and ontology for the relation between mind and world. As was mentioned earlier, the rejection of Givenness entails, among other things, that there are no fixed limits to thinking that prevent it from being semantically about the world as it is in itself. Yet the rejection of Givenness also entails that the semantic structure of language does not mirror the categorical structure of the world, and this fact has consequences about the precise sense in which conceptual thinking is intentionally directed to the world as it is in itself. From the standpoint of a resolutely non-representational semantics and ontology, the realist view that there is no semantic, epistemic, or transcendental barrier in thinking being about the world as it is in itself is rehabilitated, but is given an important twist. There is indeed no such barrier provided that this direct access of thinking to being in the semantic sense of the term is itself understood as a fractured expression of a non-semantic, non-representational direct relation between mind and world. Thus understood, the direct semantic access of thought to the world, its semantic aboutness, must be sharply distinguished from the manner of directedness in which thought and world are ontologically related and implicated with one another. Ultimately, the semantic aboutness of thought, namely its directedness toward a common, public, objective world through reference relations, is revealed as an indispensable yet non-representationally functioning tool for collectively coordinating thought to the world, where both are understood as systems of natural monadic processes, where the relation between them at this level is non-referential, logical, or causal. This non-semantic expressive relation can be understood in terms of resonance between dynamically co-evolving environmental, bodily, and brain processes, whose degree of adequacy is measured by the degree of empowerment expressed in the conative processes involved. This latter conative empowerment can, in turn, be understood in terms of an expansion of the range of metastable equilibrium of these systemic relations involving our bodily, social, and natural environment. Roughly, we can distinguish between three different yet ultimately involved kinds of resonance in the aforementioned non-semantic sense between environmental, bodily, and sensory affective processes. 1. Topological isomorphisms, homeomorphisms, established in the qualitative contraction transformation of intensive worldly information from sensory affective processes of sentient organisms. This roughly corresponds to Sellarsian picturing. 2. Morphological resonances between the material and functional characteristics of sentient organisms and their environmental niche, e.g. the hydrodynamic shape and movement of sea organisms resonates better with and in water environments than in land environments. 3. Functional resonances between the behavior of a given organism and a given environment, e.g. a human being attempting to swim at sea, built a house for shelter, telling a tale about the origin of his tribe. Note that the resonances evolved in the above cases are clearly non-representational. They are entrenched by biological and cultural evolution by selection through a largely unconscious process of trial and error. Yet it is also clear that resonances in the above sense can be better or worse, less or more adequate with respect to the synchronization achieved by the processes involved and the degrees of freedom thereby expressed. Yet it must be emphasized that these two kinds of immediate connection between mind and world, namely the semantic and non-semantic, or representational and non-representational one, are distinguishable yet inseparable. Both are immediate yet non-transparent, i.e. not clear and distinct, mind-world relations, and can be illuminated only by understanding their dependence on one another. In Leibnizian terminology, we can say that the non-representational, non-semantic mind-world immediacy is distinct yet obscure, while the representational, semantic mind-world immediacy is clear yet confused. The former, non-conceptual kind of mind-world immediacy operates at a level that, while being in a sense within us, is best described as a kind of unconscious experience and thinking, and this is why it is distinct in itself, yet confused from the standpoint of conceptual consciousness. The latter conceptualized mind-world immediacy and coordination can be seen as an evolutionary tool selected and preserved precisely for organizing and making intelligible this distinct, obscure, unconscious, yet efficacious experience as something, a conceptually articulated content, that can be individually internalized and collectively communicated in a sufficiently reliable manner for enhancing collective survival and well-being. This conceptualized mind-world immediacy thereby turns the obscure, non-conceptual mind-world relation into something clear, yet only by sacrificing its distinctness. This is done by simplifying, contracting, and differentially selecting simultaneously at several spatiotemporal levels of processing the amount, variety, source, and complexity of information contained in external stimuli for maximizing our allostatic balance. This process was not evolutionarily selected for its ontological insight into the structure of reality at all spatiotemporal levels. In fact, its relative success for the purposes of survival and reproduction depends on its actively contracting the spatiotemporal, intensive, and qualitative complexity of the universe, thus avoiding informational overload and energy expenditure levels that would compromise survival. Yet it is only by way of the conceptual tools provided by this clear yet confused level that we can better understand the non-conceptual immediacy between mind and world. We cannot sidestep the conceptual level of thinking about the world and ourselves, our reason-giving practices that institute the semantic content of perception, thought, and action, and penetrate directly into the non-conceptual mind-world immediacy through some kind of non-conceptual method of intuition, a la Bergson or Deleuze. To believe so would be to flirt with mythical Givenness and would amount to a controversial subordination and relativization of conceptual rationality. Yet we are not doomed. The conceptual and categorical tools developed in the course of inquiry and its sophisticated extensions, science and philosophy, ultimately show themselves to be expressions, a subtractive manner of appearance, of a self-fracturing of the non-conceptual level itself, which enables it to better regulate itself. The conceptual level thereby asserts its indisposable role for understanding ourselves and the world without ontologically reifying our conceptual representation of the world. By being irreducible to yet complementary and mutually presupposing with the non-conceptual dimension of the mind-world relation, it thereby expresses the way of being of the mind-world relation as one of fractured immanence. Could a process view of the world or a process language overcome this bifurcation between two levels of mind-world relations, representational, non-representational, conceptually non-conceptual? We will look at this more in Chapter 4, but the short answer to this question is yes and no. Yes, in the sense that the process view of the world and the ensuing language would make salient the non-iffy, currently existing, intrinsically characterized, and dynamically evolving character of the spatio-temporal unfolding of individuals, thereby drawing our attention to each individual's actual causal history for understanding the character and unique particularity of each individual, its hixiety. And this would involve a major change not only in our worldview, but also in our practical attitudes toward beings, a focus on their unique historically unfolded particularity as opposed to being treated as subsumed and universal such as kinds, genuses, in a world general essences. On the other hand, this does not mean that the complexity and qualitative particularity of the world's dynamic unfolding would be given, clear and distinct, in all its exhaustive detail to a mind that possesses a process worldview and a process language. Presumably, a process view of the world would be neither clear yet confused, representational level, substance ontology, nor distinct yet obscure, non-representational level, monadic process world and its qualitative complexity, but rather clear yet obscure. That is, while the process worldview and language make salient the dynamic character of the individuals and of the relations which account for their unique particularity, as if it were to be any practical use and interest, it would still have to informationally compress certain aspects of the spatio-temporal, intensive and qualitative complexity, distinctness of the universe so as to make them salient for our semantic reason-giving practices. Page 83 has a page-sized figure that has been referenced and shows the relations between semantic isomorphism, topological isomorphism, and the monadic world perspective. See page 83. The figure here gives two distinguishable yet inseparable mind-world relations. One between conceptually clear yet confused mind-world semantic isomorphisms. Two between non-conceptual, distinct yet obscure mind-world non-semantic isomorphisms. These different kinds of mind-world isomorphisms themselves stand in a fractured immanent relation in that the conceptual mind-world isomorphism is effectively the expression of a self-fracturing of the mind-world non-conceptual isomorphism. This self-fracturing is expressed in the manner of monadic world perspectives. End of chapter 3.